40 days. That is how long the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has been in place. 40 days of American naval patrols, 40 days of sanctions enforcement, 40 days of pressure designed to choke off Iran's ability to export oil and force the regime to capitulate. And yet the numbers refuse to collapse. Tankers are still arriving in Chinese ports. Iranian oil is still moving. The system that was supposed to break is bending instead. Something fundamental is off in the story you have been told about how power works in the Persian Gulf. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The blockade was supposed to be decisive. The logic was clean and simple. Cut off Iran's maritime exports, the regime runs out of money, then out of options. Control the Strait of Hormuz, and you control Iran's ability to breathe. That assumption has governed American strategy in the region for decades. It feels reasonable on the surface. After all, more than 1/5 of the world's oil exports pass through that waterway. If you control the choke point, you control the flow. But what if that logic is already obsolete? What if the 21st century energy map is not as maritime dependent as Washington strategists have assumed? That question sits at the heart of what Iran has actually accomplished in the past 40 days. And the answer rewrites everything about how you should read the current crisis. The mainstream narrative is loud and consistent. Donald Trump, backed by the United States Navy and the diplomatic weight of London, launches a blockade. The goal is Iran's oil exports. The message to the world is that Washington, not Tehran, controls the flow of energy out of the Gulf. Blockades, sanctions, and naval patrols are meant to signal absolute dominance. No oil moves without American permission. The implication cascades from there. Iran is on the brink of economic collapse. Oil tankers are stranded. Pipelines are throttled. Production is forced to slow or stop. News outlets repeat the same storyline day after day. Iranian oil is trapped. Storage is running out. Time is on the west side. But the details do not hold up under scrutiny. Despite extraordinary pressure, Iran's oil keeps moving. Sometimes in the open, sometimes in the shadows, but always in defiance of the logic that was supposed to govern the blockade. And that is the first signal that the surface event is not the whole story. If you find yourself questioning whether the version of this story you have been told is complete, if you sense there is a missing piece behind Iran's persistence despite the pressure, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. The conversation that happens there is often where the real analysis begins. And if you are here because you want to see beneath the surface of what governments claim versus what the data actually shows, make sure you are subscribed so the next story reaches you the moment it breaks. The narratives that shape how we understand power and pressure are built on assumptions, and assumptions can be tested against reality. The common reading is persistent because it rests on a single foundational belief. Maritime choke points are absolute. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed or controlled, Iranian oil cannot reach its buyers. This assumption feels unshakable. Over 20% of the world's oil exports pass through that waterway. The geography seems to guarantee American leverage. But what if that logic has already been superseded? What if the 21st century energy map is fundamentally different from the one that shaped strategy in the 20th? Here's what the headlines systematically miss. Iran has spent years building redundancy into its export infrastructure. Since 2018, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed sweeping sanctions, Iranian energy planners have mapped out alternatives for every potential choke point. They have bet on a future where sea routes are vulnerable and land routes become the pressure relief valve. The blockade of Hormuz is not the final move in this game. It is the opening act in a much larger contest of adaptation and resilience. Most observers stop their analysis at the blockade itself. That is the critical mistake. The real question is what Iran does next and why the system keeps bending instead of breaking. The deeper you go into how Iran has adapted, the harder it becomes to take the surface version seriously. Let me show you how the system actually works, because the mechanics matter more than the headlines. The Iranian response did not begin in May of this year, or even with this blockade. The groundwork was laid years earlier. Since 2018, when sanctions were reimposed, Iran's energy planners have mapped out alternatives for every single choke point in the system. The first layer of defense is storage. Iranian engineers quietly reopened and expanded oil storage sites that had been mothballed for years. When maritime exports slowed under pressure, tank farms on Karg Island, Siri Island, and even remote inland locations absorbed the surplus production. But storage is only the first pressure relief valve. It buys time. It does not solve the problem. The second, far more decisive layer is logistics. Specifically, the activation of a trans-Eurasian rail link connecting Iran directly to China through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. This rail corridor became fully operational in May of last year. Freight trains loaded with specialized oil tank cars now move crude and refined products overland, completely bypassing the bottleneck of the Persian Gulf. Transit time is slashed from 40 days by sea to just 15 days by rail. The volume per shipment is lower. No single train can match a supertanker, but the strategic effect is profound. Iran has created a land-based artery that is almost impossible for Western navies to interdict. Each train that leaves Iranian soil with oil bound for Chinese refineries is a statement. The old map of maritime dominance is being rewritten in real time, and the United States cannot stop it. What came next would prove that everything the analysts had assumed about the situation was built on a foundation that was already crumbling. The United States and its allies have tried to respond to this development through diplomatic and economic pressure. At the United Nations, American diplomats pressed their case forcefully. Mike W.S., speaking for Washington, insists that Iran is in flagrant violation of international law, that the Strait of Hormuz is not a bargaining chip, and that 100 countries back the Western position on this issue. The United Kingdom calls for the unconditional reopening of the strait, invoking the primacy of UNCLOS and the necessity of protecting global supply chains from Iranian interference. The rhetoric is strong and coordinated. But beneath the diplomatic language, the actual numbers tell a different story entirely. According to energy analysts tracking the flows, Chinese imports of Iranian oil have remained astonishingly resilient despite the blockade. Estimates place the figure as high as 1.3 million barrels per day, reaching Chinese refineries through a combination of rail transport, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, and shadow tankers operating under obscured registries. Even American intelligence agencies concede that the actual volume is higher than official statistics admit. The blockade is not delivering the knockout blow that was promised. Meanwhile, the economic misery inside the United States is mounting in ways that most analysts did not anticipate. A Gallup poll now places consumer pain at a 20-year high, with energy prices driving inflation and public anger reaching levels not seen in 2 decades. The logic of the blockade is turning inward. The longer it continues, the more it hurts American consumers and the American economy, not Iranian strategists. The pain is being felt in grocery stores and at gas pumps across America. Yet the narrative in Western capitals remains stubborn and unchanged. Iran is cast as the aggressor, accused of laying sea mines, firing on civilian ships, and threatening to charge tolls for passage through the strait. Resolution 2217, adopted with 136 co-sponsors at the Security Council, demands that Iran cease its attacks and restore free navigation immediately. But Russia and China are no longer silent observers. The Russian representative points out the double standard that the West applies. Western powers who violate international law in other regions now accuse Iran of the same violations. The core argument from Moscow is that the real destabilization began not with Iranian actions, but with the U.S.-Israeli military campaign, a campaign that upended the entire region and forced Iran to adapt by any means necessary for survival. When the Russian delegate asks why everything had to begin with the attack on Iran, he is exposing the narrative gap that few in the West are willing to address. That single decision set off a chain of events that most observers still have not fully mapped, and the consequences are still unfolding today. The Persian Gulf supplies a fifth of global oil and more than a third of liquefied natural gas. When the Gulf is destabilized, the pain radiates outward, not just to Tehran, but to London, Washington, New York, and Beijing. Every capital that depends on energy imports is affected. The price of miscalculation is being paid in every energy importing nation on Earth. Iran's response at the United Nations is equally blunt and uncompromising. Their representative rejects Western allegations as baseless, accuses the United States of piracy and hostage-taking, and insists that Iran, as the principal coastal state, has the right to secure its territorial waters against hostile actions. Iran is not a party to the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, and it uses this legal ambiguity to justify its own measures. Measures that include redirecting oil by land routes, detaining ships involved in what it deems illegal activity, and leveraging its geography as both shield and sword against external pressure. The most revealing part is not the legal argument, but the operational one. Iran has demonstrated in 40 days and counting that it can sustain oil exports despite the most intense maritime pressure in decades. Every barrel that moves by rail is a quiet defeat for the logic of the blockade. Every train that crosses the border into Central Asia is proof that the old model is failing. Here is where the stakes escalate beyond the immediate crisis. Every attempt by Washington to tighten the noose produces a new workaround. Each new sanction is met with a new tactic. Hidden tankers appear, parallel banking systems emerge, barter deals are struck. And now the rail corridor across Central Asia becomes operational at scale. The volume is not the only metric that matters in this equation. What matters is the demonstration effect. If Iran can bypass the world's most heavily policed maritime choke point, what does that mean for the future of energy warfare? What happens when other sanctioned states, think Russia, Venezuela, or even a future China, invest in similar land-based routes? The weaponization of supply chains cuts both ways. The longer the blockade lasts, the more incentive there is for alternative infrastructure to mature and become redundant. This is the open loop that Western strategists now face. Will the blockade force Iran to capitulate, or will it accelerate the obsolescence of the very tools meant to enforce compliance? The answer is becoming clear in the data. The impact is not just economic or logistical. It is psychological and strategic. The narrative of American omnipotence in the Gulf is being chipped away, one trainload at a time. The global South sees Iran not as a rogue actor, but as a victim of Western overreach, attempting to survive through ingenuity. Each diplomatic confrontation at the United Nations becomes a theater in which the West's double standards are laid bare for the world to see. When Iranian and Russian delegates point to Gaza and accuse the United States and its allies of enabling atrocities, they are reframing the entire story. Who is the aggressor, and who is defending sovereignty? The more the West insists on the moral high ground, the easier it becomes for its rivals to point out the cracks in the edifice. The story is not just about oil. It is about narrative control, legitimacy, and the shifting foundations of global order itself. But the key insight lands here, at the center of everything. The real masterstroke is not the rail link itself. It is the logic behind it. Iran has internalized a fundamental truth that every system can be gamed, every choke point can be bypassed, and every act of pressure is also an invitation to innovate. The blockade, intended as a weapon of last resort, has become a catalyst for the very resilience it was meant to destroy. Every time a U.S. official demands unconditional compliance, what they are really doing is accelerating the search for alternatives. The more sanctions bite, the more the world's energy map bends away from maritime monopolies and toward multipolar, multi-route networks. Iran is not just resisting, it is rewriting the rules of economic warfare in plain sight. That realization changes everything about how you read what happens next and what has already happened without anyone calling it by its real name. What happens if this logic spreads across the global system? Imagine a world where the next sanctioned state, whether Venezuela, Russia, or even a future Saudi Arabia, has already learned the lessons of Iran's adaptation. The more pressure is applied, the greater the incentive to build redundancy, diversify routes, and invest in land-based corridors immune to naval power. The United States, once the undisputed master of maritime strategy, finds its leverage eroding by degrees. The real test is not whether Iran survives this blockade. It is whether the tools of pressure themselves become obsolete. If the Eurasian rail network becomes the norm rather than the exception, the rules of energy security and coercion will have to be rewritten from the ground up. At that point, every new sanction imposed carries the risk of diminishing returns, not just for Iran, but for every state that depends on the threat of economic isolation to enforce its will. Meanwhile, the unresolved narrative thread that began with the blockade remains open. Will the United States double down, or will it adapt? If Washington refuses to recognize the limits of its own tools, it risks being trapped by the very logic it once wielded. The collapse of the old model will not be announced in headlines. It will happen in the background, in trade statistics, in infrastructure projects, in the quiet flow of goods across borders the United States can no longer surveil or control. The next escalation may not come at sea, but on land, in boardrooms, and in the shifting alliances of a world that no longer accepts a single point of failure. What does all of this reveal about the deeper logic at work? It is not just about Iran or Trump or even the Strait of Hormuz. It is about the way power is exercised, resisted, and ultimately redefined in an era when the old tools no longer work as promised. The instruments that built an empire, blockades, sanctions, gunboat diplomacy, are now being turned inside out by the very adversaries they were meant to subdue. The resilience of Iran is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of a system that rewards adaptation and innovation. The moral claims of the West are being tested against the hard mathematics of survival, logistics, and narrative warfare. And the question that lingers is not whether Iran can hold out. It is whether the world is watching the last act of an old play or the opening scene of a new one. The part that stays with me is not the outcome itself. It is the moment when the people who understood exactly what was happening chose to say nothing, chose to maintain the old narrative even as the evidence contradicted it. The question worth sitting with is not whether this outcome was avoidable, but whether any institution involved had the incentive to prevent it. Where do you think that line is? Leave your answer in the comments. The logic of the blockade is being inverted, and the world is learning the lesson in real time. The next move belongs to those who understand that the age of maritime monopolies is ending.